archaeology and artificial intelligence. What the hell do those two things have in common? Well, I'll tell you, because the point of my talk today is to talk to you about cloud civilizations, where the savannah and the metaverse meet. When I was preparing for the TEDx talk, they said, make sure that you shock them, right, at the very beginning. I thought, okay. They also told me to speak slowly, which I can't promise that, but I'm too excited about this topic. But, okay, shock them. Well, here we go, nice and easy. Two postulates today that I want to share with you. First of all, that nation states are dying. And second of all, that we need to evolutionarily adapt to the new reality of cloud civilizations. Okay, here we are. I'm asking for the second time in about 30 seconds already, what the hell does that mean? So let's start with some basic definitions just to set the playing ground. Basically, nation states are conglomerates, bits of people put together that have a shared culture, often have a shared ethnicity, shared language, often a shared currency. The idea of the nation state and the history of a nation state is a complicated and a long one, but if we want to look into kind of more recent history, it first gets codified around the kind of Peace of Westphalia, which was at the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648, specifically the Treaty of Münster. We have the first mention of the nation states. But really, the nation states as we know them, there might be French people amongst you, British people amongst you, Czech people amongst you. That's really a post-World War II phenomenon. Basically the era of decolonization, the kind of era of self-determination. So the nation states that we're living in are actually laughably modern, often less than 100 years. In kind of various topics and various kind of areas of expertise, we see breadcrumbs everywhere of these kind of nation states kind of losing their function, losing their purpose, and slowly deteriorating. Whether that's the biggest drop in the democratic index since 2006, inflation, various economic crises, record migration of people to technological platforms, increased rate of globalization despite the pandemic, and even academic postulates. So people like Das Gupta and many, many others are talking about the deterioration of the nation state. Cloud civilizations, right, okay, I'll be honest, I made this term up, right, because like every academic's got to have a term that they kind of make up and then they pretend to be very important about it. But basically, I believe that cloud civilizations that are global are essentially a digital blanket on the world as we know it. You can imagine them as telemedicine, blockchain, cryptocurrencies, online educational platforms that are not necessarily connected to any kind of state institution. And we kind of see them appearing slowly, like a 3D version of the internet that is connected to the real world, but is enabled and scaled thanks to modern technological platforms. However, as much as I would love to, and when I had the first iteration of my TED Talk, it was about 45 minutes, about 60 slides, and they said, yeah, can you tone down the academic side a little bit, maybe talk about your life story instead. So I thought, okay, great. Chance would have it, a few weeks ago, I turned 30, so I realized, like, the nation state...
I thought you were like 45, darling.
So I thought, okay, I'll actually tell you how the hell I got to this place in the first place, why I'm an academic dedicating my life to this aloof term, terminus technicus of the cloud civilizations, because it's a big gamble. So basically, I'll split the TED Talk into three kind of key periods of my life and the key lessons that I took from those that led me to the very point today, and that's something that I strongly believe in. Let's start off with a kid picture. It always gets them going. Right, so this is me looking very much like a boy, already with a little shovel, so you can see I was into archaeology from a very early age. But I was a really curious kid, right? I loved everything. Like, observe, please, my certificate from Multimedia Studies from 1999, yeah? It was in Microsoft Paint, pretty much, but like, yeah, big, hardcore stuff. I love dogs, animals, archaeology massively, and I was just pretty much into absolutely everything. Sorry, I'll get emotional here, but my family really, really supported me here, and really supported me in this curiosity. And I've got my mum in the audience, who was great and is great in supporting me in terms of doing what I want to do. I was really lucky that I was in a very multidisciplinary family. So from my granddad's teaching me how engines of World War II planes work, to archaeology, to psychology, to learning to cook, I was a very, very lucky kid to have that support and all that curiosity. The breaking point, however, for me, I'm a bit of a mutt. I have Polish, Czech, Vietnamese blood in me. And we moved to Vietnam in the year 2000 at the break of the millennium. And that was a massive, massive change. I started learning English, which basically became my kind of native tongue almost. I was exposed to a lot of different cultures. You can see, for example, this is actually quite a funny story. When we went on a trip to neighboring Cambodia, I was, of course, like completely taken apart by the Angkor Wat temples. So much so that there was Michael Caine standing next to us the entire time, and my mom and dad were like, "Look, it's this really important guy." I was like, temples. So I completely missed the opportunity to say hi or whatever. But he's there in the pictures. I've got proof. So that's the most important thing. But this period of my life, this early period of my life, essentially taught me a couple of lessons. The first one was that borders are completely irrelevant. It really doesn't matter. I was exposed to an international education, loads of different cultures. We traveled somewhere.
Because you're so lucky.
And the second thing was that everything is connected. It really doesn't matter whether you're doing history or archaeology or philosophy or nuclear physics. It's essentially just a massive database of human knowledge that we've been accumulating over the past thousands of years, and that we have found a way to connect. All of the data points are somehow connected. So that was the explosion in my childhood. Then came Oxford, right? This is not one of those like bragging moments, oh yeah, Oxford, but it was just one of the happiest periods of my life. I've wanted to go there ever since I was tiny. It was, as you can see, very serious education, no beer or pubs or party, very serious.
Wow.
But I studied archaeology and anthropology, then very serious education, no beer or pubs or party, very serious. But I studied archaeology and anthropology. Then I specialized in cognitive and evolutionary anthropology, specifically the evolution of symbolic thought and music under the late, unfortunately, Ian Morley. And it was basically, it gave me the academic underpinning for everything that I was already so interested in. But then I was like, okay, I've got the great education, what do I do with it? So I thought, okay, know exactly what I'll do with it. I'll become a curator in the British Museum. Which was great, good idea, except I sent them about 15 applications and they responded to nada, zero, nothing. So I thought, okay, that's maybe a bit of a change of plan needed, need to evolutionarily adapt to the situation, got rent to pay in London. So I went into the startup world, and this was a big chunk of my career, huge chunk of my career. I worked in tech throughout this entire time. I was, for example, working on digital campaigns in politics. That was a lot of fun, a lot of interesting stories, but we were non-partisan. So, for example, I helped build both sides of the digital infrastructure of Brexit. I worked on around 50 campaigns all over the world, including non-profits, but also corporate companies. I did artificial intelligence for museums and galleries, predicting visitation. I worked in Industry 4.0, using artificial intelligence to predict whether big machines are going to break or not. And I was, again, like seeing that really borders don't matter at all. I was working in teams where we had a 9-hour time difference. I was flying to 10 different places every month. It was just, you're just living the life and using tech, and you don't really care who you're talking to or where you are at the moment. All you need is your debit card and you're good to travel, maybe a passport as well. So what are the lessons that I learned from this period of my life? I'll be honest with you, it was an exceptionally difficult period of my life. It was roughly 9 years. The work was crazy. It was every day 4-hour commuting, 15-hour working days, waking up at 3 a.m. to take a call with Los Angeles to make sure that all the data that is leaking is actually going to be fine. It was a lot of fun, especially in politics. But the 3 key lessons that I learned was that A, everything apart from evolution is a temporary social construct. Christmases, birthdays, TED Talks, nation states, it is a social construct. The second of all was that tech can solve virtually any problem. I'm not like a crazy, aloof tech optimist, but we've literally got tools to solve pretty much any problem in the world. Third of all, people don't really understand tech. So often I'd be up against a senior innovation manager who didn't know what artificial intelligence was, but he was buying it and spending millions of pounds on it. So many times I came across someone who just had no idea how an Excel spreadsheet works properly. So there was a huge gap, no matter what startup I worked in, between the potential of the technology and the way that people actually understood it. After this period, I returned back into the Czech Republic, and I started missing archaeology a lot, and anthropology as well. COVID came, and all of these lessons that I learned in my time in the tech sector became even more woefully critical than ever before. We were in a time of crisis, and we weren't able to deal with it, although we had the tools to do so. New kind of social problems came up, and every day they were getting more accentuated, more problematic. Whether it's the erosion of trust, fake news, conspiracy theories, questioning of democracy and whether even it's the optimal social structure, the war in Ukraine, death of the nation state. But on the other hand, you have all the tools that you could possibly dream of. Like Ramses II would probably cut off his right arm to have at least a portion of those tools that we have now. Whether it's the metaverse, Web 3.0, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, we can deal with those problems, but the dialogue isn't going on. So I thought, okay, I'll start talking about it. And I was talking about it, and I was going around various cities, and I would have like 5
an
people.
evolutionary impulse. You know, you can't modify yourself to health. You can't modify yourself to spirituality through messing with your genetics.
Further carried into the public sphere, carried it straight from the Nazis, here, yet also being fallen beings come from fallen worlds. Of the alien creator god mythology takes the baton to the earth. This is the exact
Fetch notion after all.
chosen channels finding a place in the mainstream propaganda campaign. Our tradition does not end there. It finds light and influence in another avenue. The number one streaming platform from Mars, lowest one, 90s or specific ideologies of the individual to interpret creatively on their own, the individual's consciousness, and it is part of and planetary development to feed and enable the stream in our, not on impulse, not because you have been told to. Ideology. I can't wait to share this next chapter with you.
And that's going to potentially be our human body template, the seed germ that contains the entire journey of the human being. Its sort of completed form, or the power to complete our evolutionary journey. So even though we were in this sort of more nebulous astral form, within us there was still this seed that would lead to our perpetual regeneration in a higher image, that would allow us to grow epoch to epoch to epoch, to take on a more complex and advanced material form. It was all within us. Even though we weren't expressing our totally perfected form, our completed form at that time, it was still within us. It was still part of our very being. And it is today, within us today, within our form today. There is every single incarnation our form has had, going back to our very materialization here, our most faintest materialization in the Polarian phase of development. That is also still within us, within the seed germ within us. Just like our most advanced form, when we reach that level of angelic human, that is also within us as well. And so we are, in a sense, in time. But that timelessness is still within us as like a seed germ that we tap into and evolve from, if that makes sense. So the first two planetary epochs are very rarely spoken about. You don't hear a lot about the Polarian or Hyperborean epoch, simply because the form is so unrelatable to us that it's very difficult. It's very difficult to conceptualize what it's like to be in a totally opposite condition than what we are now. But by the time we get to Lemuria, by the time we get to the Lemurian epoch, we start to get a lot more physical. And this is where usually people begin to have some memories of within their being, or it begins to become relatable. The form becomes probably most relatable. It's like the earliest way we can go back and observe the form, because it's kind of I guess it's like the first relatable form that we have now. But the beginning of Lemuria was still very etheric, and then by the middle and end of Lemuria, our form actually becomes denser and denser and denser and denser until eventually it becomes sort of like a jelly, okay? It becomes sort of like a more physical jelly. It's still very pliable. A lot of the great seers of the past have described it as being almost like, kind of like a fish or having fish bones. And very, very basic organ system. And most of our soul was actually hovering outside of the form. Most of the consciousness was actually not yet woven into the form as we are today. It was actually hanging out outside of the body. And absolutely the kind of soul essences were outside the body too in the earlier epochs. So in Lemuria, that soul essence is drawn down a little bit closer into the body as it gets heavier and denser, as the planet gets more dense and humanity and the form gets more dense as well. But ultimately, what we could describe as the soul or the consciousness of the human being is actually sort of hovering just above it. And they're creating the form with their mind. You could see it as being, they're sort of, in a way, it's sort of like they're dreaming the form into existence. That's one way of viewing it. And of course, because we didn't have organs as we know it, these earlier phases of development had a completely different way of reproducing. The ways in which we reproduced during that epoch was through mitosis. So it was kind of like a daughter cell splitting off. And there was no gender in the beginning of the Lemurian epoch, but then by the end of the Lemurian epoch, we do see the proper form, the proper human form, not with all of its organs yet or its complex system. We see the beginning of the form, and we see the very beginning of genders splitting, but it's very like prepubescent looking. It's not the sort of forms and levels of maturity that we have now that began in the Atlantean epoch, okay? So just discussing those first three planetary epochs, we can see that the human form that we have today was in completely different conditions. You know, it was a different condition in the Polarian epoch, to the Hyperborean epoch, to the Lemurian epoch. It's getting denser and denser and denser as we go, which is what we call the materialization arc. And as we get denser and denser, the human form is becoming more defined and more similar to what we have now. It's becoming more complex. All right, and suddenly the form is beginning to more and more mirror and express and become an exact embodiment of the cosmos, right? So ultimately, this was happening through the two ways that we discussed. The human form was exposed to certain cosmic rays or spiritual rays from the cosmos itself and the sun, and the body was shifting over time because of these influences. However, there were also beings in the angelic hierarchy, which we could really call ourselves, if you will, because those beings in the spiritual hierarchies or angelic hierarchies truly sacrificed an aspect of themselves for us to exist. And so we are them and they are us. We are joined through that sacrifice. So ultimately, you could call it our higher selves or these higher spiritual beings in the hierarchy. They're also beaming their consciousness downward and also assisting in the creation of this form. So I didn't say that an alien being came and, took our genetics and